Support Lightning Debate on Patreon.
Hi guys, Jeff here, and I'm coming at you with part 4 in the LD for Dummies series. So this video comes at the request of Waffles Inc. and they asked me to cover what you should do when you are responding for critiques and how to write critiques. So critiques are usually one of the more daunting type of arguments when you're first starting out in LD, but really it's not that complicated and they're not that hard to write and to respond to once you understand what they are and how to write them. So let's just get right into it. So first, let's recap what we covered in the series so far. In part 1, we covered how to write your framework. So how to write your value-value criterion, what are value-value criterions, and the importance of ought is also covered in part 1. In part 2, we covered how to write your case, how to write your contentions, how to format your case, and how to make sure that your framework and case have good synergy. In part 3, we covered how to win the framework debate when the debate happens in the framework on whose framework is superior and how to win and why you should try to win the framework debate. That's covered in part 3 of the series. So if you haven't checked out any of these videos or don't know anything about these concepts, I would suggest you check out the videos in the description and see if you can improve yourself and get yourself up to speed. All right, so we're going to be moving on. So we're going to cover critiques today. So what is a critique? A critique, and yes, that's the way it's spelled. I don't know who decided it's going to be spelled with 2 Ks, but that's how it's spelled. It's a type of argument that's mainly focused on, well, critiquing the type of discourse generated by the resolution rather than actually debating on the resolution itself. So its objective is not saying that the resolution itself is wrong, that's saying that it's an incorrect statement, but the way it's written promotes either harmful consequences or encourages immoral, illogical, or overall rigid ways of thinking about the topic. So it usually says that the way the resolution is written tries to promote some form of agenda that shouldn't be promoted. So here's an example of what a critique would be. All right, so resolve, domesticated animals ought to have human rights. So potential critique is the idea that an animal must be domesticated in order to be even considered to have human rights. So an animal is still an animal. A dog is still a dog, whether it's a stray dog, a wild dog. The fact that it's domesticated should not be any sort of constraining idea on whether or not they should be considered to have human rights or not. Like, it's an animal. Just because it has been quote-unquote domesticated by a human does not make it any more or less of an animal, so it shouldn't make it any more or less considered to have human rights. So like putting that label on it to consider it humanity, because like all animals suffer abuse, deprivation, and starvation just as much as any other animal of that type, regardless of domestication. So see how it says, it doesn't say the resolution is incorrect on the AF side. It doesn't say on the AF they're not saying domesticated animals should not have human rights. They're saying they should. However, the fact is saying, okay, domesticated animals, even being put in the resolution itself is wrong. The resolution should just be animals ought to have human rights if we're going to be talking about it this way. Like, why are we just limiting it to domesticated animals, to the fact that are domesticated animals considered not animals? Are animals domesticated animals considered superior to animals? Like, is that what the resolution is trying to say? So it's saying that the way the resolution is talking about it is making people think about the subject in an inaccurate or rigid sort of way. So how would you write a critique? You'd write it literally like any other argument. The only thing that really changes with how you write a critique is how you think of the argument. Because really, most of the time when you read a resolution, your first reaction for a lot of debaters are, wow, that's going to be really hard to argue on this side. Sometimes you want to explore that feeling. Okay, why is it hard? Like, what makes it so difficult to argue on that side of the resolution when you read that resolution, and really explore what is unfair about the sides and that. So that will really help you motivate yourself and get yourself into the mindset of a critique. But usually it comes with experience. So if you don't have a lot of experience with LD, I would not suggest you try it out on your first case. You usually want to try out a critique on a case-by-case basis. But if you want to go with it, you first want to identify what you want to critique. Okay, that depends on the resolution at hand. And you also want to gather evidence and cards, and they're more likely going to be on the philosophical evidence side rather than the empirical evidence side. However, it depends, again, on what type of critique you're deciding running. For example, feminism critiques usually use more empirical evidence than philosophical evidence. Contractarian or other types of federalism type of critiques, those typically use more empirical evidence rather than the philosophical evidence. But all in all, it's more likely to see philosophical evidence rather than empirical evidence. Oh, capitalism critiques also have more empirical evidence. Forgot to mention that. Those are the more common critiques. And the third one would be to write up a contention using the format that we talked about in part 2. So if you haven't watched part 2 on how to write a contention, I would suggest you watch that now. Again, links are in the description. All right, so let's just move on. So how to respond to a critique. So you need to handle each critique on an individual basis. So I'm not going to give you a blanket, this is how you handle a critique, because each critique is vastly different. However, you want to make sure that you ask certain questions in order to understand how do you proceed, and you want to also use it the same way you'd handle a framework and try to use tactics to try to reduce and attack the critique. You want to ask yourself, is their argument based in fact or opinion? A lot of times these critiques are written by debaters based off the way they feel about the resolution. So you want to make sure that you're separating, is it based off how they feel, or do they actually have an actual point to it? It's also good to make sure that you differentiate these things in the debate space, so you're able to make sure how credible this critique is in the first place before you're intimidated by it. The second thing, does it fit well into a framework, and does the impacts of the critique outweigh your framework? So, like I said, framework is important, as I've discussed on the part 3 of LD for Dummies. So you want to make sure that when they're making this critique, does it have a solid backing on a framework? Because there are a lot of critiques that are out there that don't have very good solid framework. So you want to make sure that their framework is solid and synergizes well with their critique. So if you're not able to find flaws with the critique, you might want to try and find flaws with the framework and how the critique fits into their framework, and try to de-link their critique there. Or either that, or you want to outweigh with your framework saying, I understand your critique on that subject, however, that does not outweigh the benefits of my framework. You want to see if you can do that. You also want to see if that type of argument makes an appeal to a certain demographic. For example, feminism critiques usually appeal more to women and people on the liberal side of the political spectrum. Federalism, liberty critiques typically appeal more to men and on the conservative side of the spectrum. So you want to make sure on who is they're trying to appeal to, and you want to make sure that you understand what they're actually trying to go for. So it makes you better able to respond to the critique. And if all that fails, at least you can understand and try to use the argument of identity politics to try to say that they're just trying to use identity politics to make a divisive or controversial statement where there really isn't one. And the last one is there any level of hypocrisy in their discourse? A lot of times when people get so heated in trying to go for a critique, they miss some level of hypocrisy or contradiction in their logic. So you want to look for those levels of hypocrisy, because that makes for effective turns when you're going into the debate. So let's use an example. And this is an actual case where I had to handle a critique of my own. It wasn't that long ago. So I think it was at Princeton a couple years ago. All right. So the resolution was, wealthy nations ought to provide development assistance to other nations. So my opponent ran a critique saying that wealthy nations needing to provide for other nations made it seem that nations who are not wealthy need the help of wealthy nations. So that's the critique that they're making. They're saying that the idea that wealthy nations need to provide this developmental assistance to them made those nations seem as lesser and incapable of taking care of themselves. So how did I respond? First thing, okay, is it based in opinion or based in fact? Well, I happen to have cards and blocks on the ready saying that, okay, 70% of people in lower level African states, based off a population survey of I believe around 10,000 people across 9 different nations all said that they actually view developmental assistance from other nations as positive. Therefore, this isn't really based in fact. It's based off the opinion of my opponent, because the facts show that people who are actually receiving developmental assistance actually really liked the idea of gaining the aid. They actually viewed that aid positively. So that's a good way to start there. Now, my opponent had to make a response. My opponent's response was, okay, maybe they do, but those people are not able to have a formulated opinion based off the fact that they not have high enough education levels in order to, or not enough knowledge on the topic in order to accurately understand how the developmental assistance harms them. So how do I respond to that? Because that's a fair point. Well, you respond to that because it's sort of hypocritical. Her initial argument is that wealthy nations don't need to provide to other nations because that makes it seem that these nations need their help. However, when I tell you that these people from these nations want the help of the other nations, you say they shouldn't want the help because they're not educated enough to understand they don't want the help. So your entire argument is hypocritical because you're saying that they shouldn't want it. That's because you yourself are saying that they should want it. However, when they say they want it, you're saying they're not smart enough to decide them for themselves. So you see, it shows a level of hypocrisy with the critique. Alright, so that's it for the video, guys. This was a much shorter video than I'm pretty sure a lot of people were expecting, but I'm telling you right now, writing critiques are not hard, and once you get yourself into the right mindset on how to write one, it just flows naturally. So like and subscribe, guys. I'll see you guys later. Jeff out.